of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, so we have public audience today, and we have a couple members of the public here, I see. So who all wants to, Joan? Mr. Balboni, are you going to talk today too, or just watching?
He's waiting to see what I say.
Okay.
And then
Mr.
he'll be a tag
Yes, I'd
along.
like to address the board. if I
So
may.
ladies first, Joan.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And please do limit your comments to 3
I'll
minutes.
give you my name and address. Joan Coe, 26 Whitcomb Drive. The responsibility of the Board of Finance is to give guidance to the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Education prior to developing the budget. The Board of Finance should set the budgeting policy and make sure that each expenditure is allocated properly. Operating expenditures should not be placed in the capital expenditures. It is also the responsibility of the Board of Finance to review the debt policy. A special revenue fund was developed for Simsbury Farms for accountability and making sure that expenditures and revenues will make the fund whole. Taxpayer dollars were not supposed to close the deficit year after year. Presently, the taxpayers are paying $122,000 for the shortfall. Every year, there is an infusion of money from the general fund. The taxpayers are paying for the golf course that continues to lose money. Golf courses are losing money on a regular basis. Simsbury Farms Golf Course does not include capital expenditures in the Special Revenue Fund. Many towns and private clubs have contracted out the golf course to management companies such as the Arnold Palmer Group with good results. Bloomfield has found that the Arnold Palmer Group is cost-effective and gives the golfers an opportunity to play on many of the golf courses under their umbrella. The taxpayers can no longer support the golf course that continually loses money year after year. The Board of Education can no longer expect the state to support Simsbury schools as they have in the past. With reduced enrollment, it is time to consolidate resources and buildings. The expectation that fees for permits from the building department will enhance the revenue should not be used as a tool for long-term planning. The Board of Finance has to continually review the supply of the buildings with the balance of demand on these products. There is always the possibility that the building stock will outweigh the demand, leading to lower assessments as the demand contracts. The Simsbury mill rate of 39.99 must be reduced to make Simsbury competitive with our neighbors for homes and businesses. There will be many challenges in the future for the Board of Finance. We can no longer use the general fund for political purposes, but for unexpected expenditures. The Board of Finance must be bold in their guidance to the boards and commissions with the future of less revenue leading to reduced expenditures. I'm looking forward to having a professional town manager that is not an experiment, as stated by First Selectman Lisa Heavner, to develop a fiscally responsible budget under the guidance of the Board of Selectmen. All of my comments will be posted on Simsbury Patch, Twitter at Joan Coe, Newsfeed on Facebook, and Simsbury Forum Topics. Thank you for listening, and I hope you take heed of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Coe. Oh, you're here.
Well, no, I will echo the thank you and apologize for being a few minutes late. Mr. Kalishman?
Thank you. Robert Kalishman, Simsbury. Thank you for an opportunity to allow me to address the board. And before I start my remarks, I'd like to mention the fact that your previous chair lady, Miss Pettigene, had indicated to me that she would require or ask for a vote for public audience. and it was never forthcoming, but I understand she's left the area, and there's no way to really contact her and ask her what happened. But I think it's time to more or less emulate the town of Simsbury Board of Selectmen, which at each and every meeting they have public audience. This is a privilege that you should allot to the citizens of Simsbury, because your decisions, in my opinion, are some of the most important of the town. Because a lot of these agencies will not operate without your permission or your funding, which I think you're not, well, maybe you are aware of it. But nevertheless, let me go into my remarks. You know, grammatically, jargon is helpful, but it's not a reality. You know, you can talk all you want about the jargon and on the budget, but if it doesn't relate to the people, they have no idea what's going on. And a good example is today. What do we have? We don't even have a dozen people, and we have one of the most important things, in my opinion, an opportunity to address this board and say, hey guys, this is what we should do or try to do. And then, just as we prepare, you know, to receive a house guest, we prepare our homes, we try to make it full of love, so when our guests come, we more or less convey to them that we love them and we like them and they're friends. And, you know, we may look at it, but inwardly, that should be in our hearts, because that's supposedly what we're taught. And that's one of the golden rules that I like to go by, is the hospitality. Now, the budget is too high. And it should reflect the cuts that are being made at the government level, such as the state. Your cut should reflect the state. It shouldn't be that we have to go to the reserve of the people of Simsbury to cover the cuts that are being made at a higher level. And not only cover those cuts, it should also be made so that we don't have to accept money from veterans of Simsbury that was meant for a monument, and because they come up short or they needed money to play with, they took this grant money, in my opinion, they put it into the general fund and they played with it. Then finally they realized that the people, the grantors that were observing the fund, the Environmental Protection Agency, which had the jurisdiction over the fund. In other words, the Environmental Protection people said how that money had to be spent. And the town took the money. And then all of a sudden they realized that they couldn't take the money because the rules read that they had to have their own engineer develop the monument. The monument was developed up in Vermont by the engineers and designers from the Vermont quarry where the stone was quarried. So it came back and they couldn't do it. So then what did they do? They came up with a cockamamie, in my opinion, with an excuse. Well, we'll bring in our own people. Oh, we have to fix the walk and we have to do this. But that money belonged to the veterans. And it ended up and if you look for it today, and it doesn't reflect your cuts, because it's their play money or their cookie jar. Because they took, at Monday's meeting, they voted to take the $30,000 or more and put it into the general fund. And there's where the money is now. It's probably spent already.
Is this the same Veterans Memorial, Mr. Councilman, that we helped fund? No.
Sir?
I was asking if it was the same money. I think we had spent $100,000.
I don't think we have a lot of,
What had happened was the veterans had money, then they received a state grant. they received the state grant, then all of a sudden, they wanted the money back, and now they gave it back. At one time, we gave, 6 months ago, Lanza gave the money back, and then at Monday's meeting, he gave him another check for over $30,000. The treasurer's right here, he can tell you where the money came from.
Thank you.
And the thing is, now, what I'm saying to you is now, when you get the message from on high, and it comes down, and you have to reflect the new budget, which you should, I think what you have to do is you have to put both feet on the ground and say to the Board of Education, and I'm glad he's here, because it was a shame for them to get up and put their hands on their hips and say to you, we're not going to cut our budget by $40,000. And that's exactly what they said to you. And you're the last resort here. You're the finance people. And if you were to take that message to the people, what they're doing there, it's a shame. And I attended the meeting, and I'll close with this. I attended the meeting in the library the day that the superintendent of the Board of Education for Simsbury said that I'm the superintendent and I want lockers in Henry James School. And every student and every mother wrote a letter to him and said, we don't need the lockers. But nevertheless, he took, I think, $200,000 or so, and he spent it because he was the superintendent of Simsbury. And recently, I was in a grinder shop, and the fellow that owns the grinder shop said to me, why do we pay 4 principals $150,000 each? For 4 high schools. Do we have that many schools in Simsbury that we have to pay for $150,000? Or is it because it's a golden cow? Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? All right, great. Thank you. And thank you, Linda, for kicking this all off. Appreciate it. Our next item of business is the approval of minutes from our special meeting held September 28th, 2017.
So moved.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right, and we have Moira's on the phone.
She's muted her line.
She's muted, but we assume.
Yes, I am.
All right, great, thank you. Speak up if you have anything that you would like to contribute. I appreciate that.
Will do.
Next will be the state budget update, state budgets,
State
as
fiasco
the world
update.
turns. This is sand through the hourglass.
I'll give a brief update, and you should have in your packets there now a little more condensed version of the state budget analysis that we've done now. We had 6 or 7 times. This is the governor's 4th that he has proposed, but as you know, there's been Democrat, Republican budgets, adopted budgets, vetoed budgets. So where we are, just the other day, the governor released a 4th compromise budget. Not terribly different than the quote-unquote compromise budget from September 8th. You'll recall this was about a week before the ultimate budget vote, where it looked like the Democrats and the governor were going to work this out ahead of time, and that failed, and in its place the Republican budget passed. But similar to that was proposed the week before that, kind of back and forth. We don't always get updates of what the Simsbury impact would be at each of those little sub-iterations, so this is kind of the last comparison we had. But this budget was about $1 million better than that budget was. That was the one that you'll recall we were talking about based on where we budgeted. When you kind of add both our expenditure contingency and the revenue assumptions we made, we would have been short about $800,000. This $1 million better is about $220,000 better than where we budgeted. So, it's difficult to say. I don't even think it goes without saying at this point, but there are those that were saying, this was going to end up somewhere between the governor's last budget and the Republican adopted budget. This is in between those two, obviously. And you know, whether it's the new worst-case scenario. I went to a talk by Ben Barnes last week, and he said it's pretty safe to assume that, you know, the governor's, well, his last budget was sort of the floor, and I would assume therefore this is sort of the floor where the negotiations will be. But he said really the worst-case scenario is that they don't pass the budget at all. So, and we all know that. That's the current executive order we're under. That's more like that's exactly how you calculate it, but around $9 or $10 million impact. Clearly, that's the worst-case scenario, is no adopted budget at all. But in light of that, it looks, I don't know, cautiously optimistic that they will pass something like this, and we would, I think, based on where we plan, we'd be pretty close to right, at least for fiscal 18.
Has there been any indication of what the legislature's most recent, we're very close to an agreement, looks like?
You know, there's not. I mean, we keep hearing, again, at this talk that Ben Barnes was talking about last week, he said all along, even since February, there's been about a $300 million gap, which, in his words, sounds like a lot of money. But in the scheme of a $20 billion budget, it's actually, it can be found. You know, and he said whether it's on the revenue side or in cuts, but there are certain things that people hold dear on the cuts, and there's certain will not move on the revenue generation. And he said one of the legislative leaders came to him just last week and said, you know, it's that same $300 million that it was. They were kind of realizing we've gotten all the way down here, and my understanding is of that $300 million, the Republicans have about $100 million that they could possibly move on. And the Dems have about $100 million, but then
So
now
it's really
you're
only
stuck
100.
with- Exactly. And this is what we're kind of hearing. The inside scoop is they're down to 100 that nobody can quite identify yet. So again, you know, it seems kind of crazy to say that, but that is attainable. It's just, you know, it's a little bit of a game
Somebody has to
of
blink.
chicken or blink, right? Somebody's got to blink, but you know, I mean, we've kind of seen it all this year. It's hard to sort of be surprised, but I hope. I mean, the current plan is a vote. The leaders have called the members in for an October 23rd session. That would be a week from yesterday, on Monday. So we'll see.
So one other question, because I didn't print out the expanded spreadsheet, but the
Right.
town state, town share of the ARC for the teacher's retirement is, you know, in here at 800,000, down from the original 6 million or whatever, 10 million or whatever it was.
Original was 3.4.
3.4.
Just the pension arc.
Yeah, that was, but that would represent what percentage? That was our, we were gonna pay 30% or 25%?
So of total cost, the new proposal and what this 819 is the normal cost for the pension, and I'll have to consult my notes on the exact difference, but it has to do with the amount that we're paying. Therefore, I believe is not for any of the unfunded prior liability. It would be our normal cost for our current teachers. that
But
we
we've
should
never
send.
paid that before.
We've never paid either of them, right, of course, before, but you're right. Originally, they were kind of giving us,
And were there iterations of the budgets between this one going back where it wasn't in at all?
yes, well, in the adopted Republican budget, it was not.
It's
at all.
always been in Malloy's
In
budget.
Malloy's budget, it's always been there, but the September one, it was for exactly 819,097, same 819. So
So I
it's,
just observed that it seems now inevitable that the dam, there's a leak in the dike, and this is
Coming our way.
the beginning, and it will build over this.
right, I think, the nose under the camel tent. I think the 800, I mean, I will say it's highly unlikely it finds its way back to 3 million in fiscal 18. Even the secretary was saying they're realizing.
It's
in
equally
October-
likely it finds its way back to zero.
Right, yeah, exactly. But they are saying and understanding, I think what this compromise budget tries to do is recognize the fact that towns have already well into the next budget. And so at least making them whole, so to speak, for 1 year. That might be why the $1 million is not too far off from the 819 there.
The 819, would you say, would be what's required to fund the current liability, not the unfunded liability, correct?
That is correct, except I think this is actually, I have to double check my notes, I think it's half of the current liability. I think they were
Yes,
phasing that
50%.
part over 2 years, right, so 50%. So you could expect if they,
Oh, it's not even 1 year? Or is it
Year two would be the.
year 2 would be about 1.6 million.
double this number?
Yeah, again, under the governor's conversation.
And there's no proposal at this point for reform for new people coming into the system for with the unions?
More contributions. They did change it though, didn't they? Or not? No.
Or are you talking about for the teachers' retirement?
Teachers,
There's
yeah.
been changes to the general state pension contributions. And for teachers, all I've seen is the Republican budget that talked about increasing the contribution in, but then having that money not go to the pension directly, but go towards covering the state's portion as opposed to really a direct line. So there's been some really different approaches so
He's
far.
a Democrat, figured out.
It'll continue to be a defined benefit plan then.
There have been no changes to this system yet that have actually happened.
So I guess I would just sort of suggest that, again, we had, on less perfect information than we have today, sort of picked a compromise position in the middle of the bid and ask, or the high and the low, and we're more than 25% into the year. It seems like closing that $300 million down to $100 million gap is going to leave us somewhere where we are, and that for now anyway, we probably played this all right, and I would suggest that we should certainly we will have a meeting when that's done, but a sense of urgency to do something, we should do it at a regular meeting, and unless something dramatic happens out of that ultimate. And that, we still, at that point, should consider whether it's appropriate or not to send out supplemental car tax bills or adjust. But my inclination at this point would be not to. But
Did the governor's budget?
address the car tax?
Yeah, I know it did, but I don't remember exactly how.
So, yeah, this starts to get very confusing. It does. What it has replaced, it included
I know it eliminated the state's contribution to the towns, but did it eliminate the
well, it
towns?
didn't actually do that. His
Oh,
recent
okay.
budget from just the other day
I read that it did.
included a $273,000, $273,000 payment. This is where it does start to get complicated in Simsbury's situation because we do share a mill rate with a fire district. We have that arrangement with the fire district that they will tax cars at 1 mil, and we will collect all reimbursements for that. Should they be directed as they were last year, so we're talking about to the fire district, they'll just be reimbursed back over to the town. So there's still some of those mechanics going on in this budget. They've changed names of some of the grants, which they like to do, which is very confusing when you actually try to look at fiscal 17, you'll see the 0, and then you'll see what looks like new revenue. But if you find yourself to another section of the budget, you'll see a 17 number followed by a 0.
But they've cut in this latest proposal, it looks like they've cut the amount that they would be reimbursing Simsbury substantially, but have they given relief from the 32?
Our understanding is it's up to 37 mils, but it's not completely repealed, but
Okay.
that's our read of it.
So that would be the basis on which we.
Right, so they're calculating-
Consider sending out supplemental car tax bills, but may not be worth it.
Right.
Correct.
Like Harvard.
All right, thanks. Any other questions
I
or
just
comments?
have one other question. So if with this, the total impact and the adjustment for the ARC, is that considered a reduction in the funding from the state for school? So are they cutting the amount of money that the schools are being funded? I guess my question is we're only allowed to have a 0% increase for the school budget, correct? We're not allowed to cut the school's budget.
Under the minimum budget requirement, for the Board of Ed?
Right.
That's correct.
So would this consider, or does this give us leverage to reduce the school's?
They were talking about getting rid of
I think there was implementer language in one of the prior budgets that would have addressed that. There's been talk around that topic, that if education is.
If they're cutting their funding, they gotta allow us to cut.
I don't think in what the governor released, I don't think it addressed that at least.
Yeah, that'll be in an implement.
Some have indicated there's a lawsuit that would be brought if you did that, because it would go against the MBRE, but if they change the law, I'm not sure.
Right, they have the ability to change the law, so sort of assume people that can change the law. But I
Right.
think that it is a little bit murky, to be honest.
Good catch. Good-
That would
good
only be
question.
for future years, right? Because the taxpayers have approved the current appropriations, the current budgets.
Right. Not an issue for us at this point.
Right.
Just going forward.
Yeah, just go forward.
Right. And to answer your first question, I mean, obviously it all goes into the general fund, but the ECS in this was cut. In fiscal 17, we were supposed to get 6.2 million. They cut that mid-year by about 200,000. This proposed budget by the governor was 4.3 million for the ECS. So about 1.8 off of what we had budgeted the prior year.
Right.
So I had a comment too, more for the future, but, you know, we're obviously heading down a path that's not getting better, it's getting worse with the state. And I had mentioned this to Matt, I can't remember if I said this to you too, Lisa, but, you know, we have heard a lot over the years about the cost of unfunded mandates, particularly from education. And at some point, if the cost of complying with a mandate that you wouldn't otherwise comply with exceeds what you're getting from the state, then it's a valid question to look at, why are we complying? Because I think in many cases, the enforcement mechanism is, hey, you better do this or we won't give you money. Well, at some point, the we won't give you money is like, big whoop, who cares? So, you know, I think it's worth, not immediately, but keeping that in the back of your mind, that as the picture gets worse, you know, have a list of what are the, and many of the, quote, unfunded mandates are things you want to do anyway. But if there really are things that you think are silly and that we wouldn't want to do otherwise, and you can associate a cost with them, we ought to be doing that cost-benefit analysis as we go forward through the coming years, because the amount of state funding is going to keep going down, and they probably won't repeal the mandates that we'd like them to repeal. And it's something to talk about with CABE for education, or with COST, or, you know, Council of Small Towns, or what's the other organization? CCM. To get their take on that, because, you know, maybe we can sort of force the issue of those mandates, get them to repeal them, because they won't have an enforcement mechanism over towns like us if they keep pulling away all the money. Just food for thought.
Yeah, we do take an oath of office to comply with the laws of the state, so it would be contrary to that oath, but we could have it evaluated by council. Perhaps there's something we could do that's compatible with that oath.
Yeah, you need to look at mandates that are tied to
To money.
funding versus mandates where there's a private cause of action that
Right.
is approved perhaps, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think you gotta get legal counsel to take a look at it. but-
Identifiable costs
Yeah.
is an important part of
The
it.
governor's budget did include, I know, a study of it. There's been a lot of talk, especially, it was part of the Republican budget too, I believe, on looking at least binding arbitration and some of these other obviously hotline issues, but those are some of the mandates that, you know, it has created a system that does penalize, because ability to pay is the be-all, end-all.
Right.
Towns, whether it's fund balance or with demographics, you know, similar to Simsbury, are penalized in some ways when you're trying to get a contract settled that you know is just going to ultimately be split by an
Right.
arbitrator. So those are some things that would certainly provide some relief.
Okay, great. Anything else? Laura?
No, I'm good.
Great. All right, next, Sean, is the first quarter unaudited financials.
Sure, so these are through September 30th, next packet. Just briefly, again, you know, revenues, we were just talking. I've included what we budgeted and what has been received in some of those four main items. All of the individual revenue lines are actually attached to your packet there. You know, obviously, budgeted state aid number. We've only collected $8,000 so far in state aid, so it's less than, it's about 1/10 of what we've budgeted. But property taxes, again, as in normal years, are going strong. Collections are right where they should be. Conveyance taxes have been are tracking favorably this year. There was a large transaction, the sale of Mill Commons in August. Accounted for advanced taxes. And then building fees, although just similar to last year, the first few months were tracking lower than we project. We look for $700,000 over the course of the year. But we did just last week receive a check for building permits for the assisted living facility over at the old Hartford property. And that check alone was $320,000, almost half of our annual budget. So we should finish this year better than we did, certainly than we did last year with building fees. So all revenues except for the state are doing pretty well. So there you go. On the Board of Selectmen side, just a quick glance at the Board of Selectmen expenditure budgets. These are all tracking favorably. I've included a year-to-date spend for fiscal 18 as well as this time last year, percentage-wise, for comparisons. It's a little skewed down there at operating transfers because that's where our $2.5 million contingency budget is. So obviously we have not spent any of that. In addition to that are about $500,000.
Good job, Lisa, not spending that.
That's right. This is proof. It's right here on the paper.
Yeah, no dipping in there.
And so that's included in that $3 million ultimately operating transfers anticipated during the year, which obviously once the state budget's settled will be either reallocating or settling up those accounts. And just a few notes. I mean, again, some of those that are over sort of, if things were all linear, they'd be at 25%, obviously, 1 quarter in the year. Just a few budgets that are over really are just due to one-time July or August expenditures, like the health district, pension ARC payments.
The boards and commissions, that excess 5% includes the Main Street Partnership. Does that still
Yeah.
come out of the economic development?
It comes out of the economic development section of the budget. That's just
Section
where
of the
it
budget.
always has, yeah, and that's $45,000, which is over half of the total budget for all boards and commissions, so it does kind of skew things. The rest are mostly just commission clerks and small meetings.
I think that's less than half the Main Street's overall budget, right? It used to be that they were funded on a matching basis, but I think they're now generating, I'm sure, significant dollars. Well,
I'm not sure. I know that they typically request $50,000 a year, and I know that we cut it during the by $5,000 during the budget process, but I'm not sure what their overall budget is. And that's what I have for the quarterly update.
All right, any other questions on the quarterly update? All right, capital project closeouts, discussion and possible action.
Yeah, so we may not actually have to take action tonight, but I wanted to direct you to the next, there's a schedule, a little hard to read in fine print, 2 pages there. This is a draft copy of the schedule of expenditures compared to the appropriations that you typically see in the back of our CAFR. Our auditors have been here the last 3 weeks, or 2 weeks, and I've been working with them. This is something that I know this board has discussed various times. I actually was watching SCTV video from 2014 just to try to recap the last time Joe was talking about this. And I think there's been efforts to basically close out and clean up some of these capital projects. I took this on over the last week really for the last couple of months. But with the auditors was trying to get a lot of these cleaned up, so they could be reflected as such in the fiscal 17 audit. As you can imagine, with each of these capital projects back to 08 or 06, there's just a long history of tracking of appropriations, of revenue. Some of you may remember a long conversation actually at that July 14 meeting about bond premium and how bond premium has been treated differently by different finance directors, frankly. So this is something I'm trying to get cleaned up. One thing that we really shouldn't ever have is what you see on the far right-hand side. And they're small, but they matter. These are I've highlighted them in gray there. These are expenditures in excess of appropriations. These are 4,000, and they were there last year. We didn't get a chance to clean them up. They're not big. They're $4,600 or $6,600. But ultimately, the only way to clean those up, I can't clean those up with a transfer. Those would have to be cleaned up by a supplemental appropriation, technically. So these are Eno Hall improvements from 2008. It's for $4,657 on a $1.2 million previously approved You have Simsbury Farms renovations of $3,074,000 was the original appropriation. It's over by $6,600. Now, if these had been sort of addressed in the middle of the last year that they happened, I could have, transferred these over to people's operating budgets, or we could have found another way to pay those bills without hitting and exceeding the capital expenditure. The good news is, when we're closing out projects, we have a number of projects that have cash balances on their balance sheets. So right now, those are not included in general fund reserves. I've been working closely with the auditors and with bond counsel to make sure we're treating this, because there's a lot of rules around how you can treat bond proceeds. And we need to keep town and Board of Ed separate. We need to make sure that they're kind of going like for like. So what we will ultimately need is an appropriation for those three. The appropriation could come from the capital fund, or the fund balance of any of those other projects. I think at this time I wanted to sort of bring it up so that if there was any objection to that or any discussion we wanted to have now, if I could have those made, recommended by the Board of Selectmen and made at our November meeting, I could have them reflected in the fiscal 17 financials. And ultimately, I mean, what you're seeing here is, 2 pages of outstanding capital projects that really, half of these are just done. And no one's going to spend the money's not going to get lost, but it's just, I'm worried we're going to lose something in the mix with this many open. It's a lot.
So what we really need is a policy
Right.
that would empower the Director of Finance to close out projects based on some criteria that could be time since the project was completed, or de minimis dollar amounts expressed in dollars or percentages. I don't think we can give you the authority to appropriate, so you would need to bring the small dollar overages when they happen to the board for approval. So that's the first policy.
And just a note on the policy, when we redid the policy on capital, I'm pretty sure we adopted this, that if it's not done within a year or two or whatever of the stated span from the outset, it automatically was going to be closed. Didn't we adopt that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'll have to just
So
double check
I
the
think
minutes,
that from that point going forward, you have the authority, but you've got a legacy here of
some older projects.
old stuff that needs to get cleaned up.
So let's do two things. I'll work with Sean on this to look at what the policy says and be sure that it's clear that these things can be done. Empower him. Now, does the appropriations first have to come from the Board of Selectmen?
So the Board of Finance is the appropriating board, but our charter says that supplemental appropriations to the budget are recommended by the Board of Selectmen. I guess, the only open question would be, is this supplemental to the budget? But I think it is. It's just supplemental to an older capital budget. But
So I just want to figure out, when I look at the three that are over there, they were all approved by taxpayers, because they're all over the amount requiring approval, right? Is there any issue with that?
there's not. This came up, as long as we have a supplemental appropriation, and I can get something from bond counsel that explains it, but basically, the intent in the original project was approved. These are supplemental. Often these are bills, some of these are really like a $4,000 bill for a small portion of a project, could be made as a supplemental appropriation to the budget, essentially separate from the project. It would no longer be an expenditure.
So wouldn't that be the cleanest way to do it?
Yeah, that's ultimately what I'll be asking. The cleanest way is to never let these overages happen in the middle
No,
of
I
the year.
agree, but if supplemental appropriation is needed,
Yeah.
it ought to be separate from the capital project.
Right. A couple of these, one thing that happened in 2015 that really generated a lot of confusion is when we go to approve a project, we have bond issuance expenses in the project typically, right? And when we go to bond, say we bond for $2 million and we pay, our bond counsel and PFM and all the different folks. If 5 or 6 years from now we decide to do a refunding, which is what Joe did in 2015, just like if you refinance your house, you still got to pay bond fees all over again. Now it's going to be worth it. And what typically would happen is your par amount would actually be enough to cover those refinancing costs. However, in the accounting system, sometimes that all comes in as premium, but you're seeing different bills get paid, so it actually may look like there's an additional expense of the project, and that's kind of what you've seen in some of these examples. It's not really a project. Simsbury Farms didn't get an extra, diving board. It's actually probably being paid to bond counsel twice, and wasn't part of the original appropriation. But, you know, I want to clean up the balance sheets so they're all nice, and when I get zeros on both sides, I know I can essentially delete it for the current fiscal year.
Right.
So then the second policy is really what to do with bond premiums. So when you refinance and generate basically a financing profit, we have not consistently applied that profit. You know, it's really a reduction in the interest rate from the coupon, and it should be, you know, in the business world, you'd bring that in under GAAP accounting ratably over the life of the new bond and every quarter, but.
And there's more to come on this. I know in the public sector, because our bonds are tax-free, there are arbitrage rules against creating what I thought would be an initial good idea, and something actually this board discussed in 2014, which would be something of a debt service reserve fund. After reviewing bond counsel, we can't do that. But what we could do is either a more unrestricted fund, like she referenced a mill rate stabilization fund or something else that you can use, and we can get into the options here when we try to draft a policy. But the town has treated bond premium differently in different times. You can take it down from the par amount for each project. You can also apply it to your interest. You can commingle it with general fund if you're going to pay it towards your interest payments for the next year. So we do need to talk about what we want to do with bond premium, because it is additional cash over and above what we're borrowing, but the use of it, in theory, is helping keep our interest rates. We're getting such a large amount of bond premium because our interest rate, effective interest rate, is much, much lower than most communities.
Whatever policy we create, we want to be sure we don't put ourselves in a box where we can't do the most economic deal.
And it's
Usually have the choice. In the example that Sean just gave, you could have borrowed less, and then when you add back the premium, you would have had the same amount of money to spend. So you want to borrow $10 million, you can, because of the rates, you could end up borrowing you get 11 million, 10 million of principal and $1 million of premium. You could have just borrowed 9 million and paid the interest on the 10 because it had the 9, you know, that kind of thing. But you don't want a policy that puts you in a box, because market conditions and market appetite for these kind of instruments, you know, I'm sure we did the most economic deals we could at the time.
And you never know. I mean, this year was an interesting one when we issued ultimately and closed in June 29th, and we're in the middle of this state budget. When we issued about $12 million worth of debt, we had a premium of about $1.3 million that they were giving. I did just that, and we pulled down the amount we were borrowing for the Highway Pavement Management Project, 2.5. So we only used bond proceeds about 1.65 million, and took $850,000 worth of bond premium under that project. So effectively doing exactly that, but still had about 450,000 left over, which we can use this year. And one of the advisable uses of this is to pay interest. Well, if we were in a big hole this fiscal 18, depending on where the state lands, that's about $450,000 we have actually right now as budget flexibility if we needed to pay interest for this next year. It's looking like we may not have to, in which case we can put it towards a different project that's already approved. But that can be something we should talk about and have that sort of flexibility, because it's been done differently in the past.
Many of these are closed. I mean,
So can you just,
projects are closed, right?
yes, the uncommitted balance as of June 30th, is that it was the difference between what was budgeted and what was spent?
It's the difference between what was appropriated and what was spent, exactly. And one of the issues we have here are the difference between appropriations and revenues or cash, right? So ultimately, some of these projects have been appropriated at some number, but either borrowing or grants haven't come in yet, or for various reasons, revenue in a similar amount has not been put onto the balance sheet. So they can sometimes operate either in a negative cash position or positive, depending on how expenditures go. So what you have here is an uncommitted balance, is the difference between appropriated, which you ultimately are approved to spend, theoretically. Now, in the case of something like the high school, you appropriated 43 million.
Right.
We only spent 36.2.
Right.
That doesn't mean there's 7 million of cash anywhere. That just means we have technically the approval to spend it. Now, it's since 2002, there's a lot of reasons we can't spend that money anymore.
Right.
But when you close it out, now the balance sheet may see something different, depending on revenue or bond premium or other things you put onto the balance sheet. In fact, with the Simsbury High School, there's still about $250,000 of actual cash on that balance sheet. It's not $7 million,
Right.
but it's there to transfer to some of these other cash deficit projects to settle them up.
But it hasn't been expensed.
No.
It's been appropriated, so it's like a contingent liability that will never be taken in. Is that right?
That's right. Well, right, I mean,
It's like a commitment, but it's not an actual book liability. It's not a booked liability.
I mean, there are certain rules around when you have to, the amount of time you can let pass that you don't spend bond proceeds or other things. So you can't, we couldn't go spending that on a closed high school project and still meet the terms of the bond issuance. But there is cash there that we could use and appropriate.
Small amount, not 6 million.
Small, right, but the 250,000 could
want every
be
penny.
allocated, right, over to a different school project, and that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's what bond counsel would recommend. But you can't go to the general fund.
So what Sean is managing is a lot of little tiny buckets with the little tiny bits of money in them that are funds that need to be tracked separately, and they could instead be closed out and put into the general fund.
These are all special revenue funds,
Capital
Each one is set up
project
as a
funds.
capital fund, right?
project funds, are they, so they're not separate accounts, but they're separately, yeah.
Everyone, in fact, the far left, you see fund
Spreadsheet.
numbers. We are getting to the point after, you don't have fiscal 18 on here because this is the fiscal 17 audit work, but what we just approved, we are now into the 500s and we're up to about 576. 600 start the fiduciary fund, so I'm going to run out of numbers if we don't start closing these.
How many can we close? I mean,
I had a list going that are close, and some of these, I mean, need 80, or 82 cents to close. I mean, some of them are truly just clearly rounding errors, but they're in our system, and the system won't let you close them until they're completely clear. But I have close to 30 or 40 that could be closed out.
So I would suggest you go ahead and do that, and we'll approve it.
I agree.
And I can do that basically for all of them. The only one, those three that might need, well, that would need a supplemental appropriation, we could take care
So,
of.
Sean, bring us an appropriation request approved by the Board of Selectmen for the next meeting, and a recommendation to close out, from an accounting perspective, the funds the 30 that you think are done.
Or 40, whatever. it is.
40 or 100, whatever it is. All right,
All right, we'll do.
good. All right, and then the last item on our agenda is the proposed calendar for 2018. Jeff, you want to make sure these dates are all good for you?
They are perfect.
Watch at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not going to act on this tonight?
You're not going to act. In fact, we don't have to officially adopt them, I guess, until November, well, the December meeting even. But it would be good to talk about, because there are a few things that are sort of in the way this year that we might want to at least just start thinking about, and I can take some notes. But if you look at the calendar, January 16th, we've already had on there, as we always adopt the January one when we do the prior year. February 13th would be the second Tuesday. That is because the third Tuesday is during the school's winter recess, although I talked to Burke, and that apparently is not an issue, because that would conflict, moving it to the 13th would actually conflict with Board of Ed.
Right, because their normal week is the second and fourth Tuesday, yours is the third. This puts it, I think the intent was to help us, but I think keeping it on your normal third would actually be better.
Which is
So
what
that
we
would
did
be the
this year.
20th
The
then?
20th. So that one, after already sending this out, looks like that one
You're going
should
to
stay
change
our
that to the
regular.
20th?
Yep.
What's AM1 mean?
Sorry, those are, Melissa Appley helped me do this, and those are her,
Notes?
yeah, she's using the comment section in Word, and I think that's just indicating.
Okay, all
I
right.
actually they didn't print apparently.
It's a
on here.
secret code, and you're not
Oh,
telling
these are
us.
the-
Right.
Those are her comments.
Those are her comments, which I guess
Let's
didn't
see.
print, but I can read them.
Ovaltine.
Her second one, so, there's some that are sort of not exactly in our control. The March 20th, for instance, the charter says the Board of Selectmen budget has to be presented by the 31st day of March. This past year, we did it the third Tuesday. Technically, the Board of Selectmen could still be deliberating, and that could become the 27th. I mean, all we're really doing here is establishing what your regular meetings will be. We could always have special, but just note that we could decide to do that March 20th or 27th. But the Thursday, April 5th, is where every year we have this sort of issue. The charter says the first Board of Finance public hearing must be before April 10th. April 10th is school vacation week. It's also, I believe, a Tuesday this year. So the public hearing would typically be the week of April 2nd to 5th. We don't typically have hearings on a Friday night, so that's why we've chosen the 5th. This past year, that was April 6th, the Thursday night. We just need 5-day notice requirement, but otherwise, that date has some flexibility if people had a conflict or didn't want to do a Thursday night, so that's sort of a spot to think about. And then we have this problem every year where we get into the contingent part of the budget, right, where if we have one public hearing, the referendum has to be in April. If you have more than one, or a continuation of that first, which we did this past year a couple of times, you can then move the referendum to any date really you want into May. So, I just don't know if there's any thoughts on when you want.
Yeah, so I'll give you my comments on this, just for everyone to think about. Thinking back on, how we approached it this year, I think our result was very appropriate. But I do think that I sort of regret two things. One, we were waiting for better information and it never came, and so that put a lot of pressure on everybody. But the other thing it did was we didn't really, I don't think we were as focused on the two individual budgets as we would have normally, because we were waiting for more information. And so I would challenge our board to be prepared to try to meet the shorter timeline in which to approve a budget, and not automatically have in the back of our mind that we're going to, keep pushing it out like we did into June. And then try to stick to it, because I think the process might have been better. I think some of the angst we had about the cuts that needed to be made were driven by the state, but I think we could do a more thorough interaction between both boards, and in this case, probably more with the Board of Ed than with the town. But just about where we don't get to really comment on line items, but we certainly, I didn't feel like we did as in-depth a back and forth on that this year as we did the previous year, because of the great uncertainty was created. We need to have that kind of good, healthy dialogue early in the process, so that there's a good give and take before we get down to the all right, now this is what we really have to do kind of thing. That's just that would be the way I want it. So in translating that into the timeline is, I think we should make our dates like we're going to follow our standard procedure and try to get our budget set and done, realizing that the state is going to do the same thing next year that they did this year, right? Or, I mean, they're approving a two-year budget, but
That doesn't mean much.
They do that every year, though, but yeah. Right.
they'll be back talking about it again, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's,
Depending on tax collections and, right.
yeah,
deficit
so.
projections.
So that would be targeting a May referendum, though, not the,
Right,
not
and
the April referendum.
I know you build in all of this flexibility, but I would say, we ought to put our dates down, like, we're gonna do it this way this year, and then we'll adapt or adopt, a different dates if we have to.
Sure.
I think the other thing is that, Linda was, had a great vacation during the time when.
Yeah, probably will be away for some
Yeah.
of that again.
Yeah, but I mean, it at least allows us to plan a little bit and be sure we have a quorum and the like, so.
So the only other ones later after budget season to note, Tuesday, September 25th, the third Tuesday would be the sundown of Yom Kippur. So the town requests that there not be meetings on Tuesday or Wednesday. Wednesday is the Yom Kippur holiday. So that one there is that Tuesday, September 25th is the fourth Tuesday. So that's the only one
another one that's sort of an exception to the third Tuesday rule. And also, just like this year, November 13th on this schedule is the second Tuesday, because we decided last year to not have a meeting the Tuesday of Thanksgiving week, given that people sometimes travel. That's an open question. We can decide this year to do something different or not, but tentatively on this schedule. And this does bring me to a reminder for our next Board of Finance meeting, as it says here on the draft agenda for next year, is traditionally the tri-board meeting. We can talk about if that's what we want to do next month, at next month's meeting, but that's typically in the program room. We've reserved the program room at the library for the November meeting, as was on the 2017 calendar. So,
Are you saying the next meeting is a tri-board meeting?
yeah, traditionally when we adopted the 2017 version of this, we had, just like it is here, the November meeting on the second Tuesday of November, and in the program room at the library. It could still just be a Board of Finance. It doesn't have to be a tri-board if we decided not to, but we will be, once we change the location, we'll be over there.
For what it's worth, I won't be here next year, but it wasn't a very productive meeting this year. Basically, we had Board of Ed members informing us that we had no authority to look at line items and didn't understand their world. And I mean, your presentation was great, but beyond that, we didn't really, there was no definitive guidance that we provided, I guess. And so unless you guys are prepared to do that.
So let's take that under advice. I think Jeff makes a good point. The board, I'm trying to remember if I did it we had a tri-board meeting when Barb was still here.
It was Barb's last meeting last year.
That was her last
So
meeting,
it was
that's
her-
right.
She did a presentation up we were in the Board of Ed.
Oh, I
conference
was
room.
gone that day. I was not
And
here that day.
And then that's when she announced
It
that
was her,
she's.
it was her presentation that was great, yeah.
Yeah.
But then I don't think we really, from that meeting,
Right,
did anything.
right.
I mean, there was no,
There was no clear guidance of, you do not go above X or you know,
Right.
any of that, and people
Unless-
were not in unison. I think we need to get in unison before we
Right.
bother with a tri-board meeting.
So are we having a tri-board meeting next month? Is that the plan, or
I mean,
is that what's on our agenda?
Our adopted calendar is just that it will be.
Is it on your guys' calendar, Lisa? And
I informed our board to hold the date for a tri-board, but was waiting on you. I think it's a good idea to get everyone on the same page before we go into the budget season and just make sure everyone understands where we are in the budget process with the state and what the implications are. I don't think that's a bad thing. And when you lay out, I mean, your presentation is very helpful not only to the boards but to the public, laying out the process that's ahead and the obstacles we'll be confronting.
what's the date of that? Next meeting?
Tuesday the 14th.
And again, we could
Move it special, because if it is tri-board, it does take more coordinating with other boards, but,
I tend to agree with Lisa. I mean, I think it in all.
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's in the preparation.
Yeah, we need to
Correct.
know what page we want to all get.
And-
Sure.
and So maybe,
We'll have an idea, right, soon, maybe.
I mean, traditionally, we're kicking off the budget season, but now it's become almost a year-round event, right? We're almost reached a year since last year, we're still talking about it.
well, I'll reach out to both you and Matt and Burke and see if we can't figure out the right day. Sure. I think I have to be out of town that day.
They spent 15 minutes on a meeting already.
All right, so we'll send some emails out with whatever
Yeah,
ends up.
and then set up an agenda
Sure.
and, understanding when each of us will make a presentation and then a format for discussion, so that it really becomes a more productive meeting.
Make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Can I make one comment before you? Sure. Before we go? It's about policies. You've been probably wondering how long I would wait before I raised that, but I'm the policy person. We did have all these policies assigned, but we haven't done any work on any of them, and now we're heading back in. Yeah, well, exactly, we did do yours, but good thing, because you're leaving, so we would have made you come back for that.
I will also say, I did, when I took over, I did look at the list, and I felt like we were in much better shape than than some of us really thought, but
Some
I
of them are
can't.
from the 1980s, and we're not living within what's written as policy. So I won't belabor the point, but, because we're not going to get to it, I mean, November's a tri-board meeting, January, we'll be back into budget season, but, I mean, I just don't want to totally lose sight of these things,
I understand.
because these policies do need to be updated, and they, you know, they say things that we don't actually do or believe, so it's a problem.
Updated most of the really old ones now.
We don't have the facts in
Yeah.
front of us, so let's not argue whether we have or not, but I think it's not quite as bad as but there is work to be done, no
Right.
doubt, and we have done nothing, and so, noted, fair.
Our conscience has spoken.
Yes. And you have one more meeting, so we
Task
won't
master.
thank you for your service yet,
Okay.
all right? You're not thanked yet. All right, so, motion's on the
Motion to adjourn,
table.
second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Maura.
Oh, we're out early today.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you all for coming. We do appreciate your participation tonight. So thank you.
There were 11 classes that were over the place that's described in terms of class size limits, but they assigned tutors to help. I mean, I was trying to watch the Board of Ed meetings to see, I don't know how that's playing out, but.
Chief.